Okay, I see a few people are joining us. I'll just do a quick introduction to Mike and his background. He's a professor in the Strength and Hypertrophy Master's Program at Lehman College, which is in the USA. He's also a competitive bodybuilder and he's a leading expert in training for hypertrophy or building muscle. If you're interested in this topic and you've done some reading on the internet or social media, you'll no doubt have come across some of Mike's work. He's also the co-founder of Renaissance Periodization and is a regular speaker at international conferences. Like the previous experts on these webinars, Mike contributed to my textbook, Advanced Personal Training Science to Practice. Specifically, he wrote the training for hypertrophy section in the resistance training chapter. For those of you who haven't attended one of these previous webinars, the format's really simple. I ask the expert questions that you've put to me and also take questions live during the webinar. So if you've got a question, please type it into the Q&A below and I will ask Mike if we've got the time. The theme of this webinar is training for hypertrophy. So if you could keep your questions quite focused on that, rather than going off into different topics like nutrition and recovery, which we covered in the last webinar. So I can see we've got a few more participants just joining, which is great. So Mike, if you're happy, I will kick off with the first question, if that's okay.
I'm ready whenever you are.
Cool. Quite selfishly, what I do at the start of these webinars is ask a question of my own before I get into the students and the audience's questions. So one thing I just wanted to ask you is you've got obviously a lot of background and experience, both as someone that trains as a bodybuilder and trains other people and as an academic as well. What have you changed? Have you changed your mind on anything regards to training for hypertrophy? For example, is there something that you used to think was really important that you no longer believe to be the case?
No, because I think I was just correct every single time I ever guessed at anything. You know, I'm just that smart, and it feels good every day waking up, never being wrong. I don't even know if it feels good to be wrong because I've never been wrong. So there you have it. I wish that was true. So I used to think, just off the top of my head, I used to think that the compound heavy basics, squat, bench press, deadlift, weighted pull-up, standing barbell overhead press, etc. I used to think those were the best hypertrophy movements for everybody and at all times. And they were just the gold standard, and you wanted to keep them in as much as possible and progress on them in strength. And after a while, I realized that movements can be compared more objectively by something that I termed a stimulus to fatigue ratio, and that for some individuals, or probably most individuals at some point, those compound heavy basics are no longer the best stimulus to fatigue ratio exercises, and that other exercises become superior in various contexts. So, I used to essentially be dogmatic about compound heavy basics must be the best, that if you can't grow your biceps, you need more barbell curls, and all the cable stuff is stupid. Sometimes that's true for some people, but it's not universally true. And we can find out what is true in the moment by running sort of a proxy assessment of stimulus and fatigue. And then we understand after doing that, that sometimes, or many times in many cases, individuals have a wide range of exercises between individual that are the best for them at that time. And so if you see someone doing an exercise, albeit they're doing it properly, it's very difficult to say, well, I can tell you why he doesn't have a big back. It's because he's doing that exercise instead of that other one. That's unlikely to be the case. Now, that might be the case, but on principle, we would not assume that that was the case.
So the idea that the dogma of the sort of the so-called big three, and you'll hear some people in the S&C community saying, if you squat, bench, and deadlift, that's kind of all you need with a few supplementary exercises. You kind of wouldn't subscribe to that way of thinking as it relates to like training to build muscle.
Yeah, I would say it's a curiosity to say something like, that's all you need. It's not stated in a way that I prefer problems like this are stated or solutions are stated. I prefer them to be stated in a manner of optimality or seeking optimality. So, for example, if someone was talking to me about how to purchase a very excellent car or to design a very excellent car, I wouldn't really be so interested in someone that said, hey, air conditioning, power windows, good engine, and a decent frame with airbags. It's all you need. Now, hold on a second. What are even my goals? Is it to go from point A to point B? And then, yeah, absolutely. Some of those things are even frivolous. But to go from point A to point B with a certain fuel economy and a certain style and a certain comfort and a certain look, with a certain requirement for how I like the car to perform, then all of a sudden, that's all you need is really just, I think it betrays a certain degree of non-seriousness. I think a lot of times, this is like a brush aside comment, that powerlifters who are pretty big tell bodybuilders because they don't want to enter the complexity of the problems bodybuilding brings up. They'll be frustrated, or those powerlifters that are looking at very young people who are looking at bodybuilders and being like, oh, should I do hack squats or with my feet close together? And the powerlifters look at themselves and they're really big. And they say, all you need to do is the compound basics and you'll get big like me. Well, yeah, at the expense of how many injuries? How long is it going to take me to get as big as you? And will I even ever get as big as you if I don't have the same genetics? So I think a better way to say what some of those guys are saying is like, hey, in many cases, if you're not after really exotic results or you don't have any joint discomfort, you can get a lot of effect out of the big three. And if you don't want to make it any more complicated, if your goals are pretty restrained, you don't have to. Like if I'm training a housewife just for strength and she's like, look, I only want to do deadlift, squats, presses, and pull-ups, I'll be like, yeah, that's okay. As long as your joints don't start hurting, that's totally fine. But if I was looking for optimality and saying, how can I arrange my exercises, choose the right exercises to become as big as possible in the end, or to become a certain size while minimizing my fatigue or minimizing my involvement in the gym, then all of a sudden that good enough answer becomes not good enough.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's interesting when you go on some forums or just look at the comment section of some posts on Instagram or Twitter where you hear these like real simplified pieces of advice, such as you just need to squat to get big legs, or you need to, eat in a calorie deficit to lose body fat. And I often think, why are those people in those forums or looking at this content if they simplify training to that extent? Because if you know it, or if it boils down to that, it's like, what are you searching for?
Agreed.
I find it quite odd. But
I think it is important to clarify maybe that those people do have a little bit of a silver lining of truth to their statements or their intent. I think a lot of folks are like, they weigh 55 kilos and they started training 3 days ago and they want to know which way to point their toes in a hack squat. And you're like, Jesus Christ, kid, just learn how to lift weights in a basic way and don't bother with anything else, because up until 6 months or more of training, there just won't be a statistical difference in how big you get doing anything versus anything else. Your body's just so primed for growth, anything works. So why don't you use the time to practice the basic lifts, which will always transfer to other lifts and always be with you if you want to use them. And then once you are in a position where growth has declined and maybe you're facing some joint pain, then you can start to look at optimalities as opposed to pretending they exist at first. The downside of pretending they exist is you can just overwhelm yourself and cause yourself to be a nervous wreck in the gym. I mean, there's people that are, on those Reddit forums that you're talking about, asking about which way do I point my toes? And like, kid, why are you worried about this stuff, man? And a lot of times if people overthink things for long enough and think they have to be, they might quit and burn out where they shouldn't have, because they think, oh, this is way too complex and I don't want to, be this serious about it. But if they took a simpler approach, I think they would actually stick around for longer. But very few people phrase it like that. That's just really getting the silver lining out of them without their consenting to it. But what they say is like, you're dumb, you're weak, just train. But I think what they could mean better is like, you could do that and not worry as much about minutia that don't matter.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a case across all sorts of training disciplines, whether it's resistance training or endurance training, is the overcomplication, or on your side of the pond, I think you call it majoring in the minors, where
Yes.
people that are new to training are looking at sort of for these nuances and really sort of intricate things that maybe they don't need, and then they kind of get put off because it becomes overwhelming. But anyway, we'll move on to the next question. What I've done here is I've taken a group of questions that have come from different people because they were quite long-winded, and they were essentially based on volume distribution. So George Darabantpa, so sorry if I've completely got the pronunciation of your names wrong, but he asked a question along with some others. So I've reframed it just to make it a bit simpler. So a general hypertrophy recommendation is to perform 10 to 20 sets per week per major muscle group. Do you think volume distribution is important. So for example, would performing 6 sets in 2 training sessions be as effective as performing 2 sets across 6 sessions?
It's a good question. So I don't think it's important, but I think it still matters. You know, like the kind of stereo you have in your car is not important as far as overall car performance. But if you have a great stereo and you really like listening to podcasts or music, it can make a big difference on your car, you know, on your drive to and from, you know, the car park or whatever at work. So did I use that as English term, actually, car park? We don't say that in the United States. We say parking lot.
Parking lot, yeah.
I'm with it.
Know your audience, Mike. Good stuff.
That's right. So you could say things are really hotting up. That's another thing you guys say that we don't say. We say heating up. It's neither here nor there. So in any case, if you look at what we're trying to accomplish with volume distribution, you get a lot of really good answers. And I think it's really good to come back to the principles of the matter before giving an exact answer to a question. So what you want to do in any given session is to cause a robust amount of muscle growth stimulus and have a realistic amount of time you're causing that stimulus for. Usually muscles don't grow for much longer than about several days. And also you want to be wary of the fact that on the minimum end, you want to cause a robust stimulus. And on the maximum end, you want to limit the muscle damage such that it doesn't directly interfere with growth, which we've seen in research. It makes a lot of theoretical sense. If you mess up the muscle with like 15 sets at the same time, some of that is just going to go to recovering the muscle and some is going to be left for muscle growth. If you mess it with 20 or 25 sets, you may actually get a neutral response or a net neutral response of no growth because all of your free resources went to fixing the muscle. So there are limits on how hard you could train a muscle. There is such a thing as too hard. There's also such a thing as too hard from the perspective of when are you going to recover next? Because if you train really, really hard, you'll have to rest longer in order to have another productive training session. And some recent research, which is just about the most obvious thing you could ever think, but it's great that's confirmed with research from summarized recently by Brad Schoenfeld, was that you actually can track the sensitivity of muscles to hypertrophic stimuli after about 7 repeated stimuli or so. You know, like some muscles become quite insensitive to growth and you need some time to break, and how close you stagger those together certainly has an impact on how, you know, if you train a muscle really hard Monday and again really hard Tuesday, the amount of growth stimulated on Tuesday is actually quite small. And you have to ask, like, why am I going this hard Tuesday? If I waited till Wednesday or Thursday, it could actually summate quite a bit of growth while I'm growing the entire time from the thing I did Monday. So in the end, all that comes together to say that training most muscles anywhere between 2 and 4 times per week seems to be roughly equivalent as far as long-term outcomes are concerned, roughly equivalent, not exactly equivalent. And it seems to do a good job of training muscles hard enough so they're very robustly stimulated and not so hard that they take too long to recover. Now, there is a special case, a special concern with training 2 sets at a time, 6 days a week. And on the numbers, on the balance, if you can actually recover from 2 sets every day, it checks our boxes of robust stimulus. You absolutely can get a robust stimulus from 1 set, no problem. You definitely get it from 2, but it just doesn't last that long. And the muscle growth may last a day. Good news is we're training again the next day, and you can align your volume, you know, depending on what you can recover from. There is a hypothetical situation in which 2 sets is a very robust stimulus and very recoverable, and you're ready to go every single time after that, as far as the muscle is concerned. And that's a very valid thing. And then that compares probably favorably to 4 or 5 or 3 sessions per week. Maybe there are some arguments that in smaller muscles, in muscles that recover quickly, or in females who generally have smaller muscles that can recover quickly, that actually 5 or 6 may be slightly more optimal than 3 to 4 sessions per week, because that rapid recovery, the muscles otherwise just sit around for a few days and be like, why aren't we getting stimulated? We're perfectly healed. So that there is a benefit there. However, there's a downside to consider. It's a bit more of a long-term view. A view that's seen on the mesocycle level, not the microcycle level, maybe sometimes even on the block level or macrocycle level. And here it is. If you train a muscle, especially hard, especially depending on what muscle it is, how much force it generates through joints and how much external loading is required, something like quads compared to forearm flexors or something like that, or even the wrist musculature, if the muscle does a lot of joint and connective tissue, if training the muscle does a considerable amount of joint and connective tissue damage and disruption, which all training does to some extent, it can be a situation. So we know for a fact that joints and connective tissues just straight up take longer to heal than muscular damage. right? They just do, because they're poorly vascularized, relatively speaking, and they just take longer to heal. So the big problem with training a muscle 6 times a week is the muscle could very well be recovered. And in the short term, that means you get great gains. But the joint and connective tissue structures end up getting hit so much when they're already hit that you end up degrading their ability to adapt, and thus they sort of fall behind. And that can be seen in a situation where your knees really start to hurt after like 3 months of training really high frequency. Like, I've known a lot of guys to do the squat every day program. I'm sure, Paul, you're familiar with that program.
Yeah, I mean, a few years ago, I tried the Smolov program.
Sure.
Probably 10 years ago. And it's one of those things where I'm feeling it now, if that makes
Right.
sense. The knees and my joints, back in my sort of 20s, I got away with it and it was effective. And maybe it was probably from a technique, sort of motor pattern point of view, you just get better at the movement, squatting.
Yes.
But I don't think my joints thank me for it now, to be quite honest with you.
Right. And it can even happen in a shorter term that, your joints can start to be a problem for you several weeks or several months into doing high frequency training. So what I'll say is that as long as you're training any given muscle about 2 times a week on average, you're pretty damn close to being optimal. And if I had to build a case that you were suboptimal, it would be a difficult academic case to build. I could do it, but it would require a lot of really picking apart studies and saying, well, look, these by tiny margins, 3 and 4 sessions a week is better. I say 2 to 4 sessions a week for every muscle, and you're really, really in the clear. That the best answer is a theoretical one of you train a muscle as long as it's recovered, you're ready to train it again. Any number of frequencies can be optimal. And yes, there is theoretical reason to suppose that for some muscles that recover very quickly, that 5 and 6 day a week training frequency is marginally better than 3 or 4. Yes, that is a good supposition, but please, please, please be mindful of your joints and connective tissues. And when they tell you, hey, listen, I can't keep doing this, back off to it 2 times a week or something. Give your body a 1 month break. Your elbows feel amazing again. Your shoulders feel great. Then try to go 4 times a week. Your elbows and shoulders feel okay. Then do a mesocycle of 6 times a week. By the end of that, they're like, what are you doing to us? But you've got a lot of muscle gain. Take an active rest phase, come back to 2 times a week. And that way you can cycle your frequencies such that they're somewhere on average, they're sustainable. But at times you push a little beyond sustainability. And at times you pull back in order for that delayed recovery to occur. That's the real big problem with like squat everyday program, is that people just keep doing it. And then they're like, well, my knees and hips are going to be dead. So what do I do? And people on the forums are like, just use slightly less weight today and just go back tomorrow and hit it hard again. And they just keep going 6 times a week. And then I actually know people who permanently ended their squat PR career for the rest of their lives, just doing one of those 6 months bouts of squatting every day. And they got really strong. And then they just broke, like in the sense that they had like a chronic inflammatory response in their joints, that anytime they started to approach their old squat numbers, even training twice a week, they would get crazy inflammation in the joints. They essentially just, the joints were like, you know what, we've had enough of, it's like PTSD for the joints. Yeah. So I would say that be careful just chasing muscular responses, have it in context with joints as well.
And I think the answer that you've provided there within this question applies to something that's often not considered when we just look at these questions in isolation, is that you've got to take into account the training background of the person asking the question and also their age as well, because what frequency distribution might be appropriate for someone that's experienced, has got a number of years training background and already trains 3 or 4 times a week, is completely different to someone that's fairly new to resistance training and has not established that background. And I think that's something for the students and the sort of the younger PTs in this audience to consider, that not providing sort of a blanket approach. And I've noticed that a few times, that we often get these sort of sound bites from research, such as doesn't really matter about your training volume, or as long as your frequency, as long as you equate your training volume. Now, clearly that can be misconstrued. If you're putting all of your volume into one session, that's going to cause some problems for some people. So I think, just as a general comment for people listening in, is that consideration into the individual comes through on all of these questions as well. There isn't sort of just one approach we can take. Okay, I think that's a really nice answer. So I won't look into any more of those training distribution questions. I'll go on to Tina's question. It's a really good one, actually, a really interesting question. I've been reading that fatigue is not essential for stimulating hypertrophy. If this is the case, why do bodybuilders use techniques that cause lots of fatigue, such as drop sets in their training?
Yeah. So when I give the following answer, there's a very large element of comedy to how I'm going to phrase it. A total respect to the question asker. We're all friends. I will clarify this afterwards. Is it the notion that there are fatigue-free ways to enhance training response to hypertrophy, or actually to stimulate hypertrophy through training? The notion there are fatigue-free ways to do so is nonsense. Nonsense. Okay. I'll just come out and say it. Legal use of anabolics is allowed in the United Kingdom. I'm clearly on tons of gear. I use them in order to try to become as muscular and lean as possible. And I'm a super scientist, and I've been looking at every possible way to enhance my hypertrophy. There's especially ways that don't require me taking lots of drugs because they're killing me as I sit here and talk to you. I prefer to take as few of them as possible. If I stumbled upon a way to enhance a training outcome for hypertrophy training in the gym that comes at no additional impetus of fatigue, my God, that would be revolutionary. Then actually we can step back, and this is a good question though. So I'll answer it on the technical qualities. There are essentially perhaps three main drivers of hypertrophy. One is mechanical tension, one is metabolite sequestration, and the other one is cell swelling. Damage may or may not be related, but damage is sure as hell caused by all three of these. So damage is literally one of the input arrows into the general concept of fatigue, like muscular damage that ends up increasing the cytokine concentration in your blood. That's literally one of the ways we measure fatigue. And even folks that are pretty cumulative fatigue skeptical, like Menno Henselman's a good friend of mine, a great researcher in his own right, better than me. He'll say, I don't know about this cumulative fatigue business, but muscle damage is definitely fatiguing, to the system and not just to the muscle itself, definitely to the muscle itself. So if you can find a way to impose tension on a muscle, to sequester metabolites in the muscle, and to cause a robust intramuscular cell swelling response without concomitantly causing damage, you'll be the first. And that would be amazing. And I swear to God, I hope you succeed. It just doesn't exist. Now, sometimes beginners are so good at recovering fast that it looks like they don't accumulate fatigue, and sometimes they don't. So in your first several months of training, you can not net any cumulative fatigue, but get a ton of growth. That quickly comes to an end. And then you end up having to chase muscular hypertrophy by imposing a serious amount of stress on the system. Now, the good news is you want as little fatigue as possible for maximum stimulus. There are ways for a certain given stimulus to reduce the fatigue and increase the stimulus. But getting the fatigue down to zero, I mean, that would be a wellspring of I would just never leave the gym and I would do that exercise the entire time. Because if it never fatigues me, there's no downside. I can just keep growing as big as possible. It's just a fairy tale. Unfortunately, fatigue is a necessary price to pay for hypertrophy training. I'll give you a similar, not even analogy, it's a homology. It's the exact same concept in a related field. Can you imagine asking endurance athletes, hey, is there a way to improve your endurance through training without having to get tired when running all fucking week long? You'd be like, well, I sure hope we find one, but here I go running again. So I don't know if I'm being too comedic and not serious enough to answer this question, but that's my best answer so far, Paul. Let me know if I missed any sort of explanatory vector.
Do you think that some people chase the wrong thing then in applying those techniques in that they're trying to impose as much fatigue as possible?
Oh yeah, that would be insane, and there's plenty of that. So, a lot of times people will do that, and that's not their goal, but that's a side effect of a very poorly worded, kind of colloquial goal of let's really challenge the muscles, man. Let's really smash shit up. Let's break shit down. You got to break muscle down to build it back up, which is some decent element of truth, but that's not exactly mechanistically how it works. So a lot of people will they'll say, do the hard stuff. You got to squat, bench, and deadlift. You got to do heavy rack pulls because you're a pussy if you don't lift a ton of weight. And it's actually, you can get more muscle growth lifting less weight with good technique, get less fatigue. So if you just chase fatigue, or what we at RP call raw stimulus magnitude, the biggest stimulus ever can come with a huge amount of fatigue, but you can have just a slightly smaller stimulus come with much less fatigue. And if you summate multiple blocks of that, it ends up being in the net balance. You get more stimulus and less fatigue from doing easier stuff. So yeah, guys will run into walls thinking fatigue is great. They don't ever say or think fatigue itself is great, but they think the damage or the challenge or the heavy weight, that's what does it. So some people are bad at perceiving fatigue, but I will tell you this, those guys go home and take every known supplement that you should and shouldn't take to try to reduce fatigue. So they're not completely obtuse to it. They just think that's the cost you have to pay to be the boss. And they're not entirely wrong. They're wrong on the margins, and they should be aware of the fact that, yes, we should try to lower our fatigue cost for as much stimulus as we can get. But we should also theoretically understand that it's never going to be free. So here's a really good analogy this time instead of a homology. If you are shopping for some sort of item, let's say you want the cheapest and best hamburger in the London metropolitan area, like you can absolutely look at a hamburger that's 20 pounds, right? And you can say that's too expensive. The cost or the fatigue is too high for the stimulus, how tasty the burger is. And you should absolutely want a burger that tastes just as good that maybe costs 5 pounds or 7 pounds or 3 pounds. But is there a world in which you're like, well, somebody says, I heard you can get burgers at no price at all, zero. You're like, really? Are these people just giving out burgers? How is that sustainable? How's that work? And all of a sudden you have to be kind of skeptical. So yes, it's perfectly fine to try to get the most burger for your buck, but understand that trend does not lead to the burgers are free. It can lead really low, but not burgers are free. In the same way in training, if you know you have to hit a stimulus, you want to pay as little of a fatigue cost as possible. But you have to understand that fatigue cost is still a positive, non-zero number.
Yeah, that's cool. I really like the analogy. I'm a big fan of using analogies with like exercise science. I think it helps people that maybe haven't got a strong background in the science behind it. That's really useful. Thanks for that, Mike.
My pleasure.
The next question is from Chris Ellis. This is kind of on a similar theme, I guess. I understand that training close to failure is important for hypertrophy. I often fail an exercise at a sticking point, but I don't feel fatigued until the sticking point. For example, on a chest press, I can still perform reps, but not to full lockout. Would you recommend continuing the set and performing reps in the partial range?
Yeah. So that's not a terrible idea. You just have to ask a few questions about what the downstream effects of that idea are going to be as implemented. And I have at least 2 concerns about it, but that doesn't mean they're prohibitive concerns. They're just concerns you should take into account. Concern number 1 is when you're properly training to muscular failure, especially as you start to get stronger, the neural drive required and thus the nervous system fatigue imposed to getting to failure and then continuing afterwards with partials is massive. Like if you're really actually trying, if your failure looks like, good enough, I failed, then yeah, you can keep cranking out partials after, whatever, you never really failed. But if you truly fail and you're really trying hard, eyes are going to be busting out of your head, and then you keep going, the added fatigue of that is really high. The added stimulus to that may be very high, but somebody could actually ask you a contrary question and say, hey, I know you went beyond failure and that seems more effective, but what about just resting and doing another set? You wouldn't have to deal with the exponential fatigue of going beyond failure, but you certainly add more stimulus because you just do another set.
Would that be your advice in that case, Mike? Instead of sort of just pushing on with partial reps, is maybe stop the set at that point of what we'll call, say, like full technical failure, having a rest and then performing another set. Would that be sort of your approach to that?
Maybe in some situations, yes. Right. And then we can consider another factor, which is, are you selecting exercises and executing them properly such that, maybe you're not fatigued because the exercise you chose as a press is really tricep dominant in the whatever construction of the machine or where you put your hands. And it's not very pec dominant. So you're trying to hit your pecs, but you're locking out at the end and your triceps failing. And you're like, my pecs aren't even tired. Maybe it's a matter of retracting your scapulae or taking a wider grip on the machine or choosing a different execution or different machine altogether. And then all of a sudden you have a big advantage. And the other concern I have is how do we measure these things? Because tracking is important, both for telling you what to do now and also telling you how is your program going. If someone's like, hey man, I need a bigger squat to have bigger legs, you're like, I agree. And then you're like, how has your squat been lately in the past few months? Like, I don't know, man, I don't ever write anything down. You're like, okay, so who knows if what you're doing is working? Let me know when your legs grow. So you want to be able to write down stuff and track your reps. And because you want to do that, you want to have a standard stable technique. Like when you say failure, that means failure. And then if you do some partials, a question arises as like, after failure partials, what is the amplitude of that partial? Like, do you come to here and then down, or is it all the way up to here? Is it down, or is it just here at the super bottom? How do you count them? Are you still counting repetitions? Is there still a pause at the bottom? Now, if you can find a decent, reliable way to count partials, you can absolutely try taking sets to failure and then doing some bottom end partials at the end. That is a very viable strategy. But before I did that, I would try to do two things. One is biomechanically articulate yourself in such a way and or choose an exercise in which the failure point of the exercise is really close to the failure point of the muscle. And the second thing I would try to do is experiment to see if just adding another set at 2 RIR works as well or better than going beyond failure from a stimulus to fatigue ratio perspective. Sure, you can get a great stimulus going with doing essentially a mechanical drop set with some kind of pressing implement, but that might wipe you out. You might have chest and then biceps in the same day. And when you just do another 2 or 3 sets of presses, your pecs get just as swollen, great stimulus, but you feel fine as everything's 2 reps in reserve. But if you had to do a couple of those sets where you go all the way to failure and you do the bottom end partials, your training partner's yelling at you, there's sweat all over, you get to biceps, you might be like, what the hell are we even doing here? Do I even have biceps? And your motivation to train could be low because your fatigue is so high. So I'd say try to pick the low-hanging fruit first of choosing better mechanics or working on your mechanics, different exercise, standardizing of the repetition and just doing another set when you're tired at 2 reps in a reserve. If that doesn't work and you really exhaust all your options, it's perfectly fine to think of the bottom end partials as a tool. What I would say is try to quantify and objectify those as much as possible such that you have a consistent count. Say Monday last week, I did 8 full repetitions in my set here. I did 6 mini partials to like halfway height, my best guess. Next week, maybe you do 9 reps and maybe you do 7 reps, right? Like something a little bit of a way to make sure you're both programming overload and sensing how your body responds so that you know, am I going hard enough? Am I making progress? If I'm not making progress, I need to change things. I need to stop, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, you've hit upon a really good point there that I think it was a mistake I made many years ago when I first started out like training people, and that's not being able to standardize. So as a PT, often you find that clients will judge the effectiveness of a session on sort of how hard they perceive it to be and how they feel the next day. So techniques like drop sets lend themselves quite well to that. But then I'd start looking at the client's training log and I was thinking, I'm not really sure if they are improving because I've just put DS for drop set, but I didn't really record what the drop was, how many reps they performed. I just know it got a lot harder. So I think that's a key consideration for the people that are, training people, is that if you are going to use these advanced techniques, that you should firstly use them have a good reason for using them, and secondly be able to record them as well so that you can sort of monitor long-term progress. So that's a really good point that Mike mentioned in there. Before we go on to some of the live questions that are coming through, I'll just come on to this other one from Jamie Darwin. He suffers from the same problem as me by the looks of it. He says, what are your thoughts on stubborn muscle groups? No matter how much I train my calves, they don't seem to grow. In your opinion, are some muscle groups just less responsive to training?
Nope, you just haven't tried hard enough, brother. I'm just kidding. What kind of scientist would I be if I said that? So first of all, if you look at the Renaissance Periodization YouTube, which is the YouTube channel I'm on all the time, it's our YouTube channel, then I've made at least 2 or 3 videos on stubborn muscle groups and guides and responses and asymmetries and all this other stuff. So if you ever want to look there, you're going to get a much longer 20 to 30 minute answer per video than the next minute or minute and a half long answer I will give. But there is absolutely genetic variation in every muscle group as counted as far as responses are concerned. This occurs both between individuals. Like some people have really big calves genetically. Some people have really small calves and everything in between. It also occurs within an individual. Okay? Like, so for example, my chest, I don't really know how to train chest all that well compared to how I know how to train other muscle groups, because it just doesn't matter what I do for my chest. It works. My chest is a genetic freak muscle group. It's like the second muscle group I ever noticed on myself. I instantly became one of the best bench pressers in my high school, but I'm trying very hard. I was also light body weight just because my pecs are just dumb, and there they are. My biceps, on the other hand, honorable mention at best on my physique, and I've had to try everything to try to get them to grow. Now, here's the real cool ticket. They did grow, and they do grow, but more slowly, and you got to get more clever and more creative and really find out how they work, which means that for your stubborn muscle groups, you have to experiment with some stuff that's just not straightforward. And I will say most of the time in my experience, more stubborn muscle group on average tend to probably be more slow twitch dominant, which means a larger fraction of the fibers are slower twitch. So as we know from direct study, slower twitch fibers, they don't grow as much as faster twitch fibers, which also means that you'll probably be able to heal really quickly from successive bouts because slower twitch fibers tend to heal faster than faster twitch fibers. That's not great because they heal without growing much, and then they're like, ta-da, I'm ready to go again, right? It's like if you're a drill sergeant and you just beat the soldier up to death and be like, oh, it'll be at least another day before I have to put him in his place. He comes back 5 minutes later, like fresh and clean, like, what's my next job, drill sergeant? You're like, oh my God, I thought I just killed you. So what you might have to do is, I would recommend incrementally increasing the training frequency of your stubborn muscle groups, and such that you start at 2 times a week like you do for everything else, and then see how 3 times a week works, see how 4 times a week, 5 times a week, etc. And you may find that the higher frequencies is where you get your best results. Another thing, this is directly research confirmed, folks tend to respond, folks that are hard gainers in general, I'm quite sure this is muscle specific, tend to respond to marginally higher volumes better than to marginally lower volumes. So this is not, by the way, a foregone conclusion. It sure as hell wasn't in around the year 2000, 2005, when I was coming up and training. A lot of people hypothesized that the reason many people don't grow muscle is because they are chronically under-recovered, not because they're not training enough. We now know that that's certainly true some of the time, but I'd say 70% of the time, people who are pretty small could train more and get bigger with just more training volume, including more frequency. So I would experiment increasing the training volume a bit. So people will say like, well, I did 5 sets for calves. I'm like, I got you. And then what happened? I'm like, it's really hard. I did well. Okay, great. What happened next? Like, well, I didn't get sore at all. And I had full strength to do another workout the day after. I got you. Try 6 sets next time. They're like, 6 sets? Nobody does that. Okay, you will, because you're a special case and you seem to literally recover so fast that why wouldn't you train? Like if, there's no reason to assume 5 sets, some magic number, or 7 sets or 8 sets. You may be the person that has to do 10 sets of calves 4 days a week, and then you'll get amazing hypertrophy. And so I would recommend doing slightly higher frequency, incrementally playing with the volume, making sure your technique is really good, like jacked up, steroided up monsters who walk around with 300 pounds anyway. Their calves, for example, can get super big. They don't have to do anything about it. They can do calf training and their technique could suck and it still works. And they say, I know what I'm talking about. Sweet. Thank you, Mr. Steroid Addict, right? But for folks that are struggling, you might have to get really particular on your technique, really milking the eccentric, really doing a slow, deep stretch with heavy load, making sure to get that really good peak contraction, focusing on every single rep and set being well executed because you just can't afford to bounce around all the time. Don't ask the person that comes in and uses the seated calf machine, which doesn't even train your gastroc. He does like 5 reps at as much weight as goes on the machine with this little bouncy BS. And you're like, man, that guy's calves are big. He sure knows what he's doing. There's tons of calf training guides available online. Our Renaissance Periodization YouTube has a ton. Go in there and get real meticulous and be prepared to incrementally increase your frequency, incrementally increase your volume. I say after that, so long as you're recovering very well and you're attuned to your recovery cues and you're eating plenty, if your calves don't grow much, yeah, it's like your genetics, maybe you're going to have shitty calves, which I will always say in the end is who gives a shit? Like how big are Elon Musk's calves or Jeff Bezos' calves or Bill Gates' calves? I don't know, but I'd sure as hell trade my calves for some of that money.
And on that, do you think that some people end up sort of spinning their wheels on when they look at advice saying, well, hit your underdeveloped muscle group really hard as much as you can, and then they end up creating so much damage and fatigue that all they're effectively doing is just recovering. They're spending all their muscle building resources on recovering, so they're basically just blasting the muscle group too much.
Yeah, that's definitely a fraction of people. I'd say in my experience, it's a lower fraction. I'd say 30% of people who are in a situation where they're not growing enough muscle are at a risk of doing too much. I'd say 70% of people, so very roughly, or 75-25, I would say are not doing enough. And when someone's doing too much, it becomes quickly apparent. So one thing I would ask an individual is like, hey, how often are you sore? How often are you so weak the next workout that you underperform? How are your connective tissues doing? Emotionally, how hard are you working with calves? Because like if you get honest answers, you can quickly see where someone is. Like somebody could be like, dude, my calves are sore 24/7, 365. My ankles barely work anymore. And when I train calves, I have heavy metal music in my earphones. I can't hear anything. I think of my dad beating me up when I was 5 years old, and I just let every piece of rage out for 30 minutes a day for calves. I'll be like, hypothesis, you're doing too much. But if someone's like, how hard are you training calves? I've literally gotten this response from people. They're like, yeah, like I do like what most people do, like once a week after quads and hams, I'll do like 3 or 4 sets of 10 in the calf raise. I'm like, come on. Do your calves get sore? They're like, no, I don't think I know what that feels like. I'm like, okay. So like my guide to muscle soreness is this. Muscle soreness is not required for growth. But if you have a hard gaining muscle that doesn't seem to respond well, and you've never had it sore, at least since you first started training years ago, I'd say it's time to increase the relative effort, increase the per session volume, just try to see if you can exercise execution, et cetera, see if you can get some soreness. Because when a muscle is very sore, we know that's probably the top end of its stimulus range. So I'll give you a kind of a worst case scenario answer. If someone's like I've been gaining weight, I've been eating really well, enough protein, blah, blah, I'm not exercising too much, I don't walk around too much, I train my calves 4 days a week, they get sore for 1 or 2 days each time, they completely heal before my next workout, I'm hitting mini calf PRs over the past several months, and my calves still haven't grown. To be honest, Paul, I'd be like, I don't think I have anything more to input to you. All of my things would change, at least some of that kind of stuff.
The other consideration with that type of question as well, and this is just through my experience of working with a lot of different athletes that have come into the lab or when I've trained sort of the general public, is that anatomy is there's a huge genetic part of it. I've had cyclists that have come in, never lifted a weight in their life, just cycled, and they've got humongous calves that, you know, a bodybuilder will be proud with. And then I got the other cyclists, similar ability, like literally have got cankles, just the ankle and calf is of one, and it, you know, so the variation's quite big. And so I think whilst you can modify these things with training, also you've got to be realistic. Even the sort of the architecture of the muscle, you notice that some of the more successful endurance runners tend to have quite a high and all the training in the world is not going to give them a massive sort of big teardrop calf. There was a footballer, English footballer, Alan Shearer, and player called Jack Grealish, who are quite renowned for their huge calves. And both of them, I'm pretty sure that they, didn't spend a lot of time doing calf raises and things. It's just, there is a huge genetic element to this, and that's something that's always worth bearing in mind with stubborn muscle.
Yeah, another way to get to that same piece of evidence is to examine Black bodybuilders around the world, really, but in the United States specifically, people of West African ancestry oftentimes make excellent sprinters because they have a mostly tendinous calf and a very tiny gastroc. I mean, these guys are, when they turn pro in bodybuilding, they're on every steroid known to man, as much of them as people can take in many cases. They weigh 290 pounds. And you look at the calves and you're like, you kind of have small calves, bro. And he's like, don't you think I've been trying everything, damn it? Like, these people have often, turned over every rock and leaf looking for calf gains. And if they've gotten to a situation where their calves are okay, but not big, a drug-free individual who is meant to be an endurance athlete, that sort of frame, you can make your calves bigger, but probably you'll never get to like having Branch Warren's lower leg on your body. So
in your experience, Mike, as someone that's trained people, have you ever come across someone that's come to you with like an objective to put on as much muscle mass as possible, and you've just kind of looked at their frame and thought, this just isn't going to happen? You're going to get bigger, but there's no way you're going to kind of be able to compete on the big stage.
Yes, and that was through painful experience of promising things to people that I was not able to deliver, nor were they able to get from anyone else. I remember one of the experiences I had, and I mean this in all the best way. Myself and Nick Shaw, co-founder of Renaissance Periodization, we're personal trainers at a very high-end gym in New York City. And we literally trained like CEOs of major companies. We had a few billionaires in the building at various times. Crazy stuff, right? And I figured, man, I know what I'm doing. I can help these people get into shape. And some people got into amazing shape. Some people got into good shape, but some people, try as they might, man, it's as if they had this worst genetics of all time. And then I sort of thought back to the stereotype of like, who was this person in middle school? Like, they were that nerd standing in the front row of volleyball in gym class, get hit in the ball hits them in the face, they cry, and then there's just never belt for athletics. They just were. Now you give them a math test and they're like test 18 grades above their own. You're like, you have a future, sir, and it's not going to be in sport. It's going to be in something actually useful like computer programming. So a lot of times people just have different genetics, and not everyone is able to accomplish being the greatest. And see, the thing is, that's just true for all sports. And I think because we can get a feel for how the results are coming along in our own training, we seem to forget that it applies to everything. So, for example, if some secretary or administrative assistant at a financial firm came to you at age 37 and they were like, "Can I get super jacked?" You'd be like, "Yeah, sure, maybe." Maybe that's the wrong answer. But if they said, "Hey, can you make me unbelievable at basketball, like LeBron James?" Maybe not LeBron, but someone in the NBA, you'd be like, "What?" No, almost certainly not, right? There's a training limit. There's trainability is finite. It's not predictable. It's asymptotic, but it has a finite range. And some people's adaptive range is just very small. My best input on that is give yourself a few years of diligence, great training, great eating, try to do your best, try to hit the big parts great, train hard enough, train with good technique, get nice and sore and tired between sessions, 2 to 4 sessions a week. You ramp your volumes as much as you can, close to failure, etc. And if you do that for a few years and you just don't have super impressive results, the reality of the matter is there's probably no more leaves or rocks to turn over where impressive results sit. You continue to get better slowly over time, but I would ask myself then if that's really worth my time. Because if I couldn't get super jacked, and I was positive training 8 sessions a week to not really ever get super jacked, I may very well be in search of a new hobby. And remember, it's like hypertrophy training is maybe one of the most boring, terrible things you could do with your time. We all love it, but there's tons of other stuff that's great. And you could be doing that if you're not a super big responder. I would say altering your goals based on your abilities is just a sharp thing to do. Like when I was a little kid, I had the thoughts of like, I was a pretty good artist. And then I went to art class for the first time and I was like, holy shit, I'm damn near crippled. I didn't really move my nobody can even understand what I'm drawing. So I'm not going to be a fine artist. That's okay. I did some other stuff that worked out.
Cool. I'll come on to some of the live questions because they've been tottling up as we've been going. So this one's from Ben, and it goes back to the question of frequency. And he's put, how about once a week for frequency? Lots of new trainers seem to have a default programming technique of once a week. For example, a leg day. Is there ever a time and place for this?
It's fine. It works okay. Probably gets you 80% of the results in many cases as a young male that you would, 2 times plus per week would get you. But if you're going to the gym 4 or 5 times a week, anyway, you probably get better results combining muscle groups and not doing independent days such that you get 2 or 3 times per muscle per week. Another concern is with smaller females, especially with smaller muscle groups. So for example, let's say I have a female client who wants to get bigger side deltoids, right? Lateral delts. That muscle is like the size of my thumb. And it heals every day. It doesn't matter what you do to it. It heals the next day. If you train side delts once, for somebody who looks like Ronnie Coleman or, Nick Walker or Big Ramy, then yeah, their side delts may take 3 or 4 days to recover, then 3 or 4 days spent at maintenance, and then you hit it again. It's a viable way to grow. Notice it's not the best way because if they train twice a week, they'd still get better gains. But if you have a female whose side delta is the size of your thumb, her waiting 7 days is the analogical equivalent of an Olympian male doing side delts every 3 weeks. Come on now. Now, if you're untrained female and you've never trained before, you will get some growth, but then your growth will plateau. And here's the terrible part. A lot of females will be like, well, I have estrogen and no testosterone. I'm a woman. I guess this is as big as I'll get. Guess my delts just are an intractable problem. Bullshit. You can train them 3 times a week and oh my God, the gains will be insane. I've done this to tons and tons of females over the past. I've consulted other strength coaches, powerlifting coaches. Females can handle more frequency. And on almost every case, they just bloom into way better physiques within several months because you're just not pissing away lots of time once they're recovered waiting around. So yeah, once a week is okay on average, but okay on average means from some groups on the margins, smaller folks that recover faster. I'll give you another one. Faster twitch folks who are bigger, like pro bodybuilders, they can get away with 1 time a week. And for them, that might even be totally great because they impose a lot of joint connective tissue damage. They may not be able to go twice a week. And for muscles like quadriceps, I can easily make my quad sore for a week, no problem. Hams, easy. Glutes, no problem. Can make that work, no problem. That'll work for me as I'm largely, faster twitch biased and quite muscular. But, for folks but I don't need help getting jacked. I'm already jacked. Precisely the people who care about getting jacked but don't have those amazing genetics, or on the smaller end, on the slower twitch end, they're the ones for whom that bro split will work at the least that it will for anyone. So it's almost like a really nasty self-selection where who are bros? Bros is average, unintelligent, uneducated person with pretty good genetics. That's who a bro is. But of course, being that they have better genetics, for them, one time a week actually works a little bit to their advantage. As they get bigger, one time a week, because the amount of time a muscle takes to heal expands as you get more advanced, as you get bigger, the muscles take more damage, joints take more damage. For them, the one time a week was a decent meh answer when they started training, but it becomes a better and better answer the longer they train. The problem is after 15 years of training and they do the bro split, they turn to a kid who's doesn't have great genetics. He's 15 years old and he's asking them, how do I get big? And they go, train once a week. Well, for them, that's a pretty good answer now. It wasn't a great an answer when they started. For that kid, that's a shitty answer. That's not going to get him nearly as many results as he wants. So I would say an intelligent routine in almost every case begins with at least 2 times a week per muscle group training if you're serious. And one time a week can work, but not that well.
Have you noticed more recently that sort of the single set training, less frequency, sort of like the Mike Mentzer approach has become back in vogue recently with like techniques like super slow? I mean, I've noticed more people talking about that type of training and seen some people in the gym doing it. I didn't know if that was the same over where you are in the States.
No, luckily it's not. But the UK really likes its high intensity. It's that the ghost of Dorian Yates will never leave the United Kingdom, I think. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if it was coming back in the US soon. And it's just like, it's an interesting, fine way to train, but it's wrong on the margins, and that can cost you. It's almost like with muscle growth, we ask such recreational questions about it compared to serious things. Like if someone was like, hey, how can I, if an alien landed on Earth and goes, how can I make as much money as possible? Like you wouldn't tell them, hey, you go work at Taco Bell. That's fine. You know, like you need to probably like invent some new miraculous technology, be the CEO of that company, sell that stock, and voila, you have $80 billion. But, you know, with muscle growth, a lot of times beginners, they just want something that they can notice, and then it works, and then they're bought in. So people are doing the training that's the equivalent of the alien going to Taco Bell and be like, time to get rich. And he does a great job, and he makes $18 an hour at some point. But that's not exactly, you know, whatever, $10 million an hour that Elon Musk makes. So at some point, just because everyone can get some results from training, we seem to all think, well, yeah, like one time a week worked great for me. Yeah, but would it work great for you now compared to the alternatives? So keep an open mind at every point of your training career and ask yourself, like, can one time a week work? Yes. Is it because I work so hard at going to the gym? Maybe I can do better than it just working. Maybe I can do better at getting slightly better results. And if you start asking those questions, one time a week is pretty quickly ruled out, in my opinion, as like a good strategy would try to do.
Yeah, it's probably just become more popular because I think it's quite a nice thing to market and sell, in that, you know, people are often time pressed and, you know, like they're not that interested in training in the gym. So maybe it kind of corners that market of you don't need to do much, you get in, get out and do things quickly. But then, as you say, trying to apply that universally to everyone, it just doesn't really work or make sense. A few more questions have come in, and this one was actually something I was, might be the same person who asked me this question earlier in the week. Any thoughts on sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and any particular training method to achieve it, if it really exists?
So I think like methods of training that require you to function slightly more aerobically, to function in such a way that metabolite accumulation is very high. They can require more energy systems, the sort of production and more buffering and more everything else. And then your sarcoplasm has components in it, like the sarcoplasmic reticulum, et cetera, that do some of those things. And so training in such that that sort of style may expand those elements more than, you know, training for slightly lower reps and heavier weight, et cetera. So then the question is, though, does that give you a bigger overall muscle? I'm not sure if that's the case. It seems to be that it's roughly the same size muscle. You just have more components that are sarcoplasmic and fewer components that are contractile. Then you can go back and train that same muscle and go heavier, and more of the contractile elements grow in addition to that, and some of the sarcoplasmic elements go away, and then your muscle still the same size. So it's not apparent to me that, you can really have a say in overall bigger muscle growth if you focus on more sarcoplasmic type of hypertrophy than if you focus on more contractile hypertrophy. And I'll say that these are very small differences on the margins. You may be able to get 10% more sarcoplasmic tissue and 10% less contractile tissue by training for sets of 25 reps than for sets of 5 reps, which is one of the reasons why people train for sets of 5 are stronger, because you probably have a little bit more actual contractile tissue in there. Of course, the nervous system helps as well, but they also suck at endurance, because if you have sarcoplasmic elements that are very good at buffering acids and taking metabolites out, if you don't have those, you have tons of contractile elements, muscle freezes up really fast. So if you ever take power lifters and ask them to do a set of 15, they just start vomiting blood after 12 reps and it never stops. Their muscles freeze and everything. So I'd say, yeah, they're on the tail ends, on the margins, you can get some temporarily more sarcoplasmic or even permanently more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. But it's always a trade-off of one to the other at a very small margin. And if you have a goal to make as much muscle size in the future as possible, I don't think it matters a ton which one you choose. And what I would say is I would choose repetition ranges based on how much stimulus they bring in and how little fatigue they bring in. And I would say that the sarcoplasmic versus contractile is something I don't even worry about, because it always comes in one or the other. It's not like you can stack one on top of the other and somehow magically expand the muscle.
Yeah, that latter point, I think, is the approach that I would take as well, in terms of if you can't really measure it, is it that important, obsessing over what kind of adaptation you're getting? Because ultimately, most people are just looking at the sort of growth size of their muscle if they're doing this type of training, so how it's got bigger. Unless you're an athlete, I suppose, but I would always go for maybe performance measures, so are you getting stronger and recovering quicker and that type of thing, rather than worrying too much about the actual physiological adaptation that's taken place, because ultimately you don't really know. Okay, next one. Mike, when you do maintenance, do you have different volumes in comparison to when you're cutting or building muscle? And that was from Ristro.
Absolutely. So when I'm maintaining, I have maintenance volumes, and they're often much lower than the volumes I would use for cutting or gaining weight or something like that. Generally speaking, I think we see that the volumes required, and this is based on actually one specific study, it was a very long time ago, but it was a very good study, and it demonstrated that you can maintain your muscle on something between 1/3 and 1/9 the training volume that is required to make your muscle bigger. So there's a lot of nuance there. It depends on training age. It depends on the muscle. 1/3 to 1/9 is a really big range. But I'd say this: if you are doing an average of 15 sets per week for your quads to get them to grow really well, in very few cases will you lose muscle size on maintenance in your quads if you do something like 5 sets of quads per week. Let's say 5 to 10 sets of quads per week. On maintenance, if you're still using the same volumes as you were on your muscle gain phase, you are essentially summating a lot of fatigue for not a lot of benefit, because if you're not feeding the body to grow, it doesn't grow much. And if you can do much less volume and really heal up your joints and connective tissues, heal up your motivation and get ready to train again, you can benefit greatly. So I think we should see maintenance phases as opportunities to do as little as possible to maintain our muscle. And that way we prime our psychology and physiology for huge growth later on. Because if my muscles were held stable for a month in their current size, with 5 sets of quad work per week, as I come back to training, I can do 7 sets, then 9 sets, then 11 sets, then 13 sets, finally 15 sets. And I grow like crazy that entire time as I inch in. And then I go crazy for months afterwards because my muscles are so resensitized to hypertrophy. And because I only had to do 5 sets of quads for the whole week, for a month basically, my hips healed up, my knees healed up. I got really hungry for training. I was psychotic. I can't wait to train. I'm doing this super easy training routine. I don't want to do it anymore. I want to bleed on that gym floor. And then after that, you'll get your chance. But if you're always training hard, even through maintenance, on the one hand, you're not getting much out of it. And on the other hand, you're missing opportunities to really recharge. It's like working through your vacation. I'm not really sure why you're on vacation. Maybe neither are you.
And that's one that's probably quite more hard from a psychological perspective for people to do. And if you're intuitively, you think, well, if I'm doing less either intensity or volume, I'm probably going to be regressing. So therefore, I just got to keep training at this intensity, this volume, rather than dropping it down. And I suppose that's where you got to have really confidence in the process of that you won't detrain, and It's something we
Yes.
discussed in a previous webinar with Eric Helms. Is that's where you kind of just you've got to believe in the process and not get sort of sucked back into
Yes.
doing what you were doing before, because then it becomes you basically just your training intensity is just the same all year round, and
Yes.
it doesn't really
Which is
fluctuate at all.
Yeah. Actually, there'll still be a YouTube video that I've written out, but we haven't recorded yet. And this is something we face a lot of, hey, like, I think I'm doing too much, but won't I lose size if I do less? And I actually go point by point to remind people there's a huge spectrum of responses before size loss. Like if you do less than you did now, possibly you could gain more muscle because you're so well recovered. But let's say you even descended below that. There's another part where you gain as much muscle, but with less work. No benefit, but you do in 5 fewer sets per week. There's another point at which you would grow more slowly, still less volume. There's another point of even less volume at which you would grow barely at all, just barely detectably, minimum effective volume. Then there's still another point at which you would only be able to maintain. And there's another point below that in which you would actively lose muscle. But it's not like I get some gains here, and right here, I lose all my muscle. Yeah. It's like gains here, slightly worse gains, okay gains, minimum gains, maintenance. Down here is where you lose your muscle. If you go from here to here, you're not even remotely in that area. It's like saying to someone, I don't want to go to France and practice French because I'll forget English. You're like, how long are you going to France? Like 5 days. Like, get out of here. What are you talking about? Lose your English. You'll have to hit yourself in the head with a hammer. Maybe that'll work.
Yeah, I think that's spot on a lot of it, and I include myself in this. Is that what tends to happen is that you get that expectation effect from if you've been on holiday and you've not trained for a while and you come back and whatever your training is, whether it's resistance training or endurance training, your RPE goes up, and that's for people that are not familiar with RPE, that's rating of perceived exertion, or how hard you think the training is, tends to increase, and that's probably a psychological effect rather than anything physiological that's happened in terms of detraining. But we won't go down that rabbit hole. If it's okay, Mark, can I just ask you one more question, if that's cool?
Perfect. Yep.
Let me just see. Well, there's quite a few come in, so I'll just try and find one that's interesting. Okay. Should we force progressive overload or let it happen naturally? And that's from SK Wasim.
Yeah, it's a good question. I say it's a combination of both, right? So what you want to do is get into the threshold of where difficulty occurs, close to failure, for example, per set. Just talk about per set. 2 reps in reserve. Now you also want to increase the challenge over time to make sure that as you adapt, as overload happens naturally, you make sure to increase the load. The thing is, it's very difficult to tell. So 2 reps in reserve at 100 pounds or 100 kilos this week. Next week, your goal is 2 reps in reserve. What should you put on the bar? Well, did you get, can you do 102.5 at the same RIR? Maybe, but you'll never be able to know. But if you're feeling weird psychologically, you feel lazy, tired, scared, because like high rep squatting is super difficult. I don't ever want to do it. Sometimes you have to push yourself to new heights to see if you can survive and see if you can progress. So what I would say is a pre-planned progression strategy where every time you come to the gym, you have like a repetition or 2.5 kilos to the bar. And then if that is successful and you keep getting a little bit stronger, keep going. If you stop getting stronger for 2 sessions in a row, you're probably overreached. It's time to deload, relax, recover, and then start pushing it again. So over time, how much load you add is going to be reflected by the natural progression of things, which is just natural overload. Like you're just going to be able to go higher and higher if your body lets you, because it's going to stall you out fewer times. You'll have 6 weeks of going up instead of 2 weeks. But at the same time, I would say going up is great to do front-loaded programmatically. Like you have to just do it, go up, because you want to challenge yourself. You never know when your body's really psychologically just giving up on you or if it's really physical. A lot of times I've come into workouts where I was like, there's no way I can put 10 more pounds on the bar. I do it. I even beat my reps from last week. I'm like, holy shit, there's enough of me trusting my instincts. Because a lot of times if you say, I just want to let overload happen, you're not really saying that on a technical level. What you're saying is I'm going to let my daily psychology decide if I'm ready to go up in weight or not. I just wouldn't rely on that. I'd say go up in weight, nut up, get to the challenge. If you fail, then it's time to deload and recover and repeat. But if you succeed, then keep going up and again and again and again every week until you hit that wall.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's really, really good advice for particularly people that are sort of more new to training. Is essentially have a plan, but make sure it's written in pencil and it's adaptable. I think that can be a mistake that I see quite often in more so in endurance athletes really, is where they've got a regimented plan and like they're just trying to hit whether it's a particular pace or amount of miles per week, and not really listening to their body and just kind of saying, well, the spreadsheet says this, so I'm going to just keep forcing it. And then you kind of got I suppose the fancy term is auto-regulating, isn't it? To
Yes.
changing your program, having a plan, but not, making sure, being a slave to the plan and being adaptable with it. I won't take up any, we've already overrun, Mike. So I just wanted to say thanks very much for giving up your time. I'm sure everyone in the audience has found your answers really useful. I know I have, and insightful. There's a few more questions coming in now. That always happens in the last 2 minutes. You get 10 questions or so. But thanks very much, Mike. Really appreciate that. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, guys. Take care. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, cheers then, Mike. Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks for that. Okay, bye. Hey, everyone, thanks for attending. For those of you that are still with us, sorry I couldn't get around to everyone's questions, but quite a few came in there, and we've only got limited time with these experts. The next webinar that I'm going to be doing is with Greg Knuckles, who's an expert in training for strength hypertrophy. He will be answering your questions based on specifically training to improve maximal strength. So if you are interested in that subject, then look out for my updates on social media, either on Twitter or Instagram, where I'll post the link for that webinar and you can register for that one. Thanks everyone for joining this evening, and thanks for all your really good questions. I'll see you soon.